In this lecture, we're going to discuss a little bit about what occurs after signal reception. What is occurring inside of the cell that will ultimately lead to some sort of response by the cell or change in behavior of the cell. And so we're going to more closely examine the intracellular signaling that can occur in response to the ligand binding. So reception of the signal by the target cell receptor is just the first step in a signaling pathway. The receptor then must relay that signal to the inside of the cell to activate additional intracellular signaling molecules that will then elicit some sort of behavioral response in the cell. This diagram here from your textbook just shows a basic signal transduction pathway. And what we're going to focus on in this lecture is this part here. What's happening with those intracellular signaling molecules? What are the different types of responses that can occur within the cell in order to ultimately lead to the production of those effector proteins that will then ultimately lead to some sort of response in the cell? So what are some of these different things that these intracellular signaling molecules can do? They can work a few different ways. And the first example we'll look at is just a simple relay of the signal. So when a intracellular signaling molecule is relaying the signal, what it's simply doing is just passing that signal along to a series of additional intracellular signaling molecules within the cell. So the signal gets passed on from one signaling protein to the next within the cell. That's the basics of a relay pathway within the cell. The second thing that can occur intracellularly is that the signal can become amplified. So in this case, we have our intracellular protein that gets activated by ligand binding. That activated protein can then perhaps activate multiple other proteins that are further down in the signal transduction pathway. And then further, maybe those multiple proteins that have been now activated can go on and activate even more proteins further down in that signal transduction pathway. And so this amplification of the signal essentially makes the signal stronger. That single ligand binding to the receptor has now activated multiple proteins within the cell. This allows for a faster and more robust response from very few extracellular signaling molecules. Additionally, intracellular signaling can distribute or disperse the signal to multiple different intracellular molecules. So we can start with one particular protein being activated on the interior of the cell, and that might trigger a relay of one signaling pathway, but it also may trigger a second signaling pathway as well. So this can lead to more than one response from one single ligand binding to a receptor, or it can lead to a multifaceted response. So, two or more things occurring at the same time in response to that single ligand binding to the receptor. Additionally, intracellular signaling can integrate the signals. So this occurs when signals are being received from two different ligands binding to two different receptors at the same time. And from the last lecture, you know that this type of thing happens all the time. And so in integrating signals, the cell can receive signals from more than one input and then sort of combine them together into one intracellular signaling response, as we see in the diagram here on the slide. Now, one other thing to keep in mind in terms of intracellular signaling pathways is that these signaling pathways will often be subject to some sort of feedback regulation. The basics of feedback regulation is that when one of the players within the intracellular signaling pathway affects whether or not that signaling pathway continues to proceed or not. So let's take a look at the two different types of feedback regulation that could occur. What we're seeing here on the left is ligand binding to a receptor, and that's triggering a simple relay of a signaling pathway on the interior of the cell. And then furthermore, what we see is that the final protein in this relay signaling pathway can actually positively stimulate the first protein in that relay pathway to keep the pathway signaling, to keep the pathway active. We refer to this as positive feedback regulation. And this essentially serves to amplify a signal. So that single ligand binding to the receptor is, through positive feedback regulation, is just continuing to lead to that intracellular signaling pathway to continue to respond to that ligand. In contrast, let's take a look at this relay pathway that has occurred in response to a different ligand binding to a different receptor. And in this case here, we see that the final protein in that relay pathway can interact with the first protein in the relay pathway in a negative fashion. And what it actually does is it inhibits the response to the signal. And we refer to this inhibitory response as negative feedback regulation. So in this case here, that final product of the relay, of the signaling relay, would ultimately block any further response to that ligand binding at the receptor by inhibiting or blocking that first intracellular protein in the relay pathway inside the cell. So this shows you a variety of different ways that intracellular signaling molecules can work and interact, and one thing that you should keep in mind is that quite often many of these sort of responses are occurring at the same time. So relaying a signal and amplifying the signal and distributing the signal are probably all occurring simultaneously within the cell, allowing for very robust but complex intracellular responses to the binding of a ligand.